Fans spotted Jungkook's hand trembling when he stood beside Taehyung on stage. What triggered this unexpected moment? The lights exploded in a cascade of white, blinding the front row as the first notes of the encore blared through the stadium. But amid the sea of screaming fans and the roar of music, all eyes, those who watched closely, noticed something else. Something subtle. Jungkook's right hand was trembling. He stood center stage, his jaw tight, chest rising with each deep breath as sweat traced the sides of his face. The crowd's cheers rose around him like a tidal wave, but his eyes weren't on the audience. They flicked sideways toward the man standing just inches away. Taehyung? The older member stood poised, face unreadable under the dazzling stage lights. His mic was lifted, but his lips weren't moving. The air between them pulsed with a kind of electricity that had nothing to do with the sound system. Jungkook clenched his fist, as if trying to will the trembling away. But it was there, barely noticeable to the average eye, but not to the fans who knew his every move like second nature. Not to the ones who replayed fan cams in slow motion. And certainly not to Taehyung, whose gaze lingered on Jungkook for a second too long before he turned back toward the crowd and smiled. No words were exchanged. Not then. But something had already unraveled. Backstage, it was suffocatingly quiet. The kind of silence only broken by distant echoes of the encore and the occasional clatter of crew shifting equipment. Jungkook leaned against the wall, fingers twitching at his side, still gloved in the memory of that tremor. He felt it like a ghost in his palm. Taehyung hadn't spoken to him in 3 days. Not since the rehearsal incident, the one where Taehyung stormed off after Jungkook interrupted a note during harmonization. No one talked about it openly. Not even the staff. But it had fractured something. Something that used to feel unshakable. Now, with every shared stage, every choreographed spin that brought them shoulder to shoulder, Jungkook felt it. The crack. The distance. He knew he should have said something sooner. But there was fear. Not the kind that screamed or panicked. The quiet kind. The kind that rooted itself deep and subtle. The fear of not knowing what he did wrong, or worse, knowing exactly what it was, and being too late to fix it. A knock at the dressing room door broke the tension. Manager Nim peeked in. "We've got an interview in 10. Quick touch-up." Jungkook nodded but didn't move. His mind was still on the stage, on the flicker in Taehyung's expression, on the chill in the air between them despite the lights and heat. He remembered a time Taehyung used to pull him aside, ruffle his hair, call him baby bro, and tease him until he laughed even when he didn't want to. But now, the older member barely looked his way, unless it was scripted. During the interview, the group laughed. Jimin cracked jokes, Namjoon steered the questions, and Hoseok lit up the room like he always did. When the host asked about recent moments of struggle, Jungkook glanced toward Taehyung instinctively, then quickly away. His hands were under the table, still trembling. Taehyung didn't say anything. But when the segment ended and the cameras cut off, there was a brief moment, a heartbeat, where Taehyung looked Jungkook straight in the eye. Not angry, not cold, just tired. And that, somehow, was worse. Later that night, back at the hotel, Jungkook paced his room. He knew Taehyung's room was 3 doors down. He knew he could walk there. Knock. Say something. Anything. Instead, he replayed a voice memo he recorded months ago. One where he and Taehyung were messing around in the studio, laughing so hard it distorted the mic. Back when things felt easy. What had changed? Was it that night they fought about the choreography change? Was it when Jungkook canceled on that dinner with Taehyung's family due to rehearsals? Or was it something unspoken they were both too proud to acknowledge? The next morning, fans had already clipped the moment. Jungkook's hand shaking next to Taehyung, the caption read. It trended. Speculations flooded every platform. Some said it was nerves. Others insisted it was something deeper. Jungkook saw the clip, and the way his hand curled in on itself when Taehyung took a step closer during the song. They used to mirror each other effortlessly, like they shared a subconscious rhythm. Now every movement felt rehearsed, calculated. He hated it. And yet, When they arrived at the studio that afternoon for another rehearsal, Jungkook still didn't speak. Neither did Taehyung. Until the music started. Their duet verse came, a section they hadn't changed in over a year. And yet, Taehyung suddenly stepped forward, improvising slightly, his harmony sliding higher, almost challenging. Jungkook's eyes snapped up. His instinct kicked in, and his voice followed. For the first time in weeks, they were singing to each other, not just to the crowd. It was brief, barely 30 seconds, but something cracked open in that moment. Not a resolution, not an apology, but recognition. Afterward, Taehyung walked past him, brushing shoulders. It wasn't an accident, and for the first time, Jungkook's hand stopped trembling. Just for a moment. He didn't know what would come next. If they'd talk, if they'd fight again, if they'd ever get back what they lost. But something in him knew this silence couldn't last much longer. Because no matter how far they drifted, the stage would always bring them back to the same spotlight. The same breath. The same note. And in that space between one beat and the next, maybe, just maybe, there was still time to find each other again. The rain tapped gently against the glass of the practice room, a soft rhythm contrasting the tension that sat thick in the air. Jungkook stood in front of the mirror, head bowed, earbuds still in, but the music long since paused. He hadn't moved for minutes, just stood there, one hand at his side open, trembling again. The motion was almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that something inside him was still fractured. He could fake the smiles, he could sing the lines, but he couldn't fool his own body. Not when the mere presence of Taehyung stirred a whirlwind he couldn't control. Taehyung's voice echoed faintly from the hallway, talking to a staff member about wardrobe adjustments for the upcoming performance. It wasn't hostile, just detached, polite, professional. Jungkook missed the chaos of their inside jokes, the offbeat conversations that made no sense to anyone else. He missed the way Taehyung used to lean into him during group huddles, shoulder heavy with unspoken trust. Now there was space. Always space. When Taehyung finally stepped into the practice room, he paused upon seeing Jungkook. Not in surprise, but in hesitation. His eyes lingered on Jungkook's reflection for a moment longer than necessary, before he moved to the opposite side of the room without a word. They were mirrors now, reflecting each other without touching. The beat kicked in again, and they both moved on instinct. Years of training didn't allow for faltering. Each step precise, each spin flawless. But the soul of their duet, the spark that made fans hold their breath, felt hollow. Rehearsal ended without incident. No critique, no praise, just silence. A kind of silence that screamed. That night, in the dorms, the rest of the members quietly gave them space. Jin had glanced between them during dinner, sensing the weight but not pressing. Jimin had almost said something, but caught himself mid-sentence. The unspoken truce was clear. Let them figure it out, or not. No one could force the healing of a bond like theirs. Jungkook lay in bed staring at the ceiling, phone resting on his chest, screen glowing faintly. His feed was full of fan edits again. Some romanticized the tremble in his hand. Others speculated a feud. But the ones that hurt most were the quiet ones. The ones where they sang together from a year ago, laughing mid-line, harmonizing like they were one breath. He watched one video over and over, the way Taehyung had looked at him during a bridge, eyes soft, proud. He missed that Taehyung. Morning rehearsal came too fast, and the atmosphere was no different. Cold, but careful. They were partnered for blocking on stage again, a routine that forced them within arm's reach. At one point, Jungkook's hand had to brush Taehyung's shoulder as part of the choreo. He hesitated just a flicker, but Taehyung noticed. Jungkook felt him flinch almost imperceptibly. A breath caught, and then it was gone. After the session, Taehyung didn't leave immediately. He stood near the exit, arms crossed. Jungkook watched him from behind, debating. He couldn't keep going like this, so he walked over slowly, stopping a few feet away. Taehyung didn't turn, but he didn't walk away either. "You okay?" Jungkook asked, voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Taehyung's shoulders tensed, then dropped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to show the edge of his profile. "Are you?" Taehyung replied, and that single question shattered something fragile. Jungkook exhaled sharply, the air leaving his lungs like it had been held in for weeks. "I'm trying," he said honestly. "So why?" There was no dramatic reconciliation. No hug, no tears. Just those two lines. But something shifted. A thin crack in the wall between them. Later that week, during a private stage rehearsal in an empty venue, they were alone for vocal alignment. The lighting techs were on break, and the arena sat in half darkness. Jungkook sat on the edge of the stage, feet dangling, mic in hand. Taehyung stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes distant. "I saw that clip," Jungkook said quietly. Taehyung looked at him, confused. "The one where my hand was shaking," Jungkook clarified. "Beside you." Taehyung's expression softened. "I saw it too." Jungkook swallowed. "I didn't know they noticed." "They always notice," Taehyung said, walking over. "They know us better than we think." He stopped in front of Jungkook. Not too close, but close enough. "Why were you shaking?" he asked gently. No accusation in his voice, just quiet curiosity. Jungkook looked down at his hands. "Because you were next to me, and I didn't know if I was still safe there." Taehyung's breath hitched. The air stilled between them. "I never wanted you to feel unsafe," he whispered. "I know," Jungkook replied, eyes meeting his. "But it's been hard, not talking." Taehyung sat beside him, legs dangling too. For a long while, neither said a word. "I was hurt," Taehyung finally admitted. "That day in the studio, you shut me out. And then, I didn't know how to come back." "I didn't mean to shut you out," Jungkook whispered. "I just didn't want to break something by speaking wrong. So I said nothing. But that silence broke us anyway." Taehyung nodded slowly. "Yeah, it did." The arena lights slowly dimmed as the techs prepped for lighting tests. But in that quiet, half-lit space, the two of them remained seated, finally letting their guards slip, piece by piece. "I missed you," Jungkook murmured. Taehyung turned his head toward him. "I never stopped missing you." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. On the night of the live show, the energy backstage was electric. Fans had been waiting all day. The anticipation was palpable. As the countdown to their stage approached, Jungkook paced restlessly. But this time, it wasn't dread. It was something else. He saw Taehyung standing by the curtain, adjusting his earpiece. Their eyes met. Taehyung raised a brow and tilted his head slightly, as if to say, "You good?" Jungkook grinned, heart racing. "Yeah," Taehyung smiled. "Then let's give them something to remember." And they did. When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted. The music boomed, lights sweeping across the stadium like lightning. Jungkook's voice was steady, his movements precise. And when the part came where he had to reach toward Taehyung during the chorus, his hand lifted without hesitation. "No tremble." Taehyung stepped closer than rehearsed, brushing shoulders deliberately. The crowd screamed. Jungkook glanced sideways, saw Taehyung smiling. Really smiling for the first time in weeks. And he smiled back. The cameras caught it. So did the fans. Later that night, the fan cams flooded the internet. The moment Jungkook and Taehyung connected again. No more trembling. Look at their smiles. The clips trended globally, but none of them could capture the feeling between those two beats. The quiet truth of two souls finding their rhythm again. And in a world filled with noise, that silent harmony meant everything. The stage had been cleared. The lights dimmed. The sound of fans still echoed faintly outside the venue, muffled by thick concrete walls, their screams and chants lingering like ghostly whispers in the air. Jungkook sat on the edge of the dressing room couch, fingers curled around a bottle of water he hadn't even opened, his thoughts racing too fast for rest. Everything felt slow now, slower than the seconds it took him to lift his hand. Slower than the final beat of the encore, when Taehyung leaned in just enough to send his entire world off its axis. There had been no trembling tonight, no shiver running through his fingers like static. No panic in his chest? But instead of relief, what Jungkook felt was something heavier. Something vast. Like standing at the edge of something he had just barely begun to understand. Taehyung had already left the room. Quietly, as always. No grand gesture. Just the soft shuffle of his boots and the distant click of a door. Jungkook looked down at his hand again. Still steady. Still warm from the brief contact they'd shared on stage. And yet, beneath the calm, something else stirred. A memory. A weight. The realization that moments like that didn't just heal. They awakened what had been buried. Repressed. Forgotten. The footage was already circulating online. Clips from multiple angles, the smile, the glance, the shoulder touch. Fans dissected every second, frame by frame. Some cheered for the return of what they had always romanticized. Others whispered that something still felt off. Too rehearsed. Too careful. But none of them knew what had been left unsaid. What had really passed between the silence backstage and the fire under the lights. Jungkook got up slowly, tossing the unopened water bottle onto the table, then reaching for his phone. A message sat there, one that had been marked unread for over 3 weeks. From Taehyung. A single line. Are we ever going to talk about it? He hadn't replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because he hadn't known what to say. Because what it was had never been clearly defined. Was it the argument in the dance studio? The cancelled plans? The distance? Or was it something more intangible? The shift they both felt but never named? Now, staring at the message again, the weight in his chest grew unbearable. He stepped out of the room, walking briskly down the hallway, past makeup stations and storage crates, past tired staff winding up cables and folding down screens. His heart thudded faster with every step. He didn't even knock when he reached Taehyung's door. Just opened it. Taehyung was sitting on the floor, back against the bed, hair damp from a quick shower, phone in one hand, his gaze lost in nothing. He looked up slowly, eyes tired but clear. You came, he said, not surprised, just quiet. I had to, Jungkook replied, closing the door behind him. I've been waiting, but I don't even know for what. Taehyung nodded once, like he understood completely. He set the phone down beside him and motioned to the space beside him. Jungkook walked over, sinking to the floor beside him, shoulder brushing the edge of the mattress. He looked down at his hands again. They always notice, he murmured. Taehyung tilted his head. The fans? Yeah, my hand. The tremble. Everything. Even when I try to hide it. You were scared, Taehyung said gently. Back then, weren't you? I was. Still am sometimes. Of me? Jungkook hesitated. Not of you. Of what we became. Taehyung turned to face him more fully. His gaze was not hard or demanding. It was full of something softer, something sad. I was angry, Jungkook, but not for the reason you think. Not because of that stupid rehearsal, or the way you pulled back when I tried to talk. I was angry because I felt like I lost you without ever getting a chance to fight for us. Jungkook's throat tightened. He nodded slowly, eyes stinging. And I let you, he said, because I thought if I stayed quiet, it would fix itself. Like all the other fights, like all the other misunderstandings. But this wasn't just another bump. No, Taehyung said. It wasn't. There was a long silence. But it didn't feel cold this time. It felt sacred. Like the silence of a shared truth. I missed your voice, Jungkook finally said. Not just on stage. Just you. Talking to me. Laughing. Telling me about the weird dreams you had. The movies you hated. The music you thought I should hate too. Taehyung laughed softly, the sound low and aching. I still have those dreams, he said. They just weren't as funny without you to tell them to. Jungkook closed his eyes. The ache inside him bloomed again, but it was different this time. It was full of yearning, of hope. I don't know how to go back, he said. Maybe we don't, Taehyung whispered. Maybe we start from here. Different, but still us. He reached out then, slowly, and placed his hand over Jungkook's. Their fingers didn't interlock. They just rested there, connected, present. Jungkook looked down at them, his voice barely audible. It's not shaking anymore. Taehyung didn't reply. He didn't need to. The days that followed weren't perfect. They still rehearsed like professionals, still avoided eye contact in certain moments, still hesitated when the conversation veered too personal. But the wall had a crack now, and light was slipping through. They began sitting closer again during meetings, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. Taehyung started sending voice notes late at night, random, often pointless, but full of life. Jungkook responded with memes and reaction videos, and sometimes, when he was brave, with selfies. During one early morning radio show, the host asked what the members appreciated most about each other. The room fell quiet when it was Taehyung's turn. He hesitated for only a second before turning to Jungkook. He listens, he said. Even when he doesn't know what to say, he listens with everything he is. Jungkook blinked hard. And when it was his turn, he smiled. He never lets go, he replied. Even when it looks like he has. The fandom exploded again. But this time, the theories didn't matter. Not to them. Because in a world of flashing lights and endless noise, what mattered most was this quiet space they were rebuilding. One look, one word, one steady hand at a time. And slowly, with each new performance, each shared glance, the tremble became a memory. A scar, perhaps. But not a wound. Not anymore. Jungkook stood by the tall window in their temporary apartment in Tokyo, watching the streetlights blur through the condensation gathering on the glass. The city glowed with its usual chaos, cars rushing past below, neon signs blinking into the mist, but inside their space, everything was still. The curtain fluttered from the heater's quiet hum, brushing against his arm, but he didn't move. His gaze was locked on the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. Tired eyes, drawn lips, and a silence that had settled so deep inside him that even breathing felt like interruption. Behind him, the sound of a kettle clicked off. Footsteps. Then the soft clink of ceramic against wood as a cup was placed on the table. He didn't have to turn to know it was Taehyung. You haven't said anything since rehearsal, Taehyung said, his voice casual but not careless. There was something behind it, like he was testing the weight of every syllable before he let it go. Jungkook exhaled slowly, still watching the world outside. Wasn't sure there was anything to say. Taehyung didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved past him, walking toward the couch, his fingers dragging lightly across the back of it before he sat. The TV was off. The only light came from the kitchen behind them and the city in front. For a while, the room was filled with the distant sounds of Tokyo breathing honks, music from a bar down the alley, laughter somewhere too far to interrupt them. Then Taehyung leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Do you remember the first time we came here? He asked. Jungkook's lips curled faintly, the ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. Yeah. You got us lost trying to find that soba shop. I didn't get us lost. The map was upside down. You were the one holding it. Taehyung huffed out a soft laugh. We ended up walking 3 hours in the wrong direction, and you didn't even complain. I didn't want you to feel bad. I didn't, Taehyung said. I was happy. It was just the two of us. No cameras, no managers, just us. I think that was one of the first times I really felt like you saw me. Jungkook turned then, finally, his back still pressed to the window, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He looked at Taehyung. Really looked at the way his jaw tensed when he was holding something back, the way his fingers rubbed slowly against his own palm when he was unsure. These were the things Jungkook had memorized years ago, and forgotten, and remembered again. I never stopped seeing you, he said quietly. Taehyung's eyes flicked up to meet his. Then why did it feel like you disappeared? Jungkook moved toward him, not sitting yet, just standing beside the couch like he didn't trust himself to be still. Because I didn't know how to be near you without falling back into what we were. And I was scared of what that meant. What it might cost. What did you think it would cost? Us. Taehyung looked up at him, his face unreadable for a second too long. Then he nodded slowly. You thought staying away would protect what was left. I thought silence was safer than messing everything up again. Taehyung leaned back, arms now spread over the top of the couch, head tilted back slightly. Do you think we're still messed up? Jungkook lowered himself into the armchair across from him, hands clasped tightly. I think we're figuring it out. But I don't know what we're building toward. I don't even know if you still trust me. I do, Taehyung said, without flinching. But I think I don't trust myself as much anymore. That admission hit deeper than Jungkook expected. Why? Because I let us fall apart, Taehyung said, voice low. Because I let pride and ego and silence stretch too far. Because when you needed me to reach out, I waited for you to do it first. Jungkook's chest tightened. He reached out then, slow and tentative, fingers brushing against the edge of Taehyung's sleeve, not grasping, just touching. I needed you, he whispered. Taehyung turned his hand, catching Jungkook's fingers in his own. The contact was soft, no fanfare, but it was real. I'm here, Taehyung replied. Later, long after midnight, they were on the balcony, leaning against the railing, wrapped in hoodies and quiet thoughts. The city was a sea of light and rhythm. Jungkook's phone buzzed with notifications, clips from the concert, theories, edits, but he ignored them. Taehyung stood beside him, sipping from a warm mug, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. I never told you this, Jungkook said, breaking the silence. But there was a time I thought I'd leave everything. Taehyung didn't look at him, but his hand tightened around the mug. When the tremors started, when I couldn't sleep, when I'd see you and feel this wall I couldn't break, I thought I'd walk away, just vanish, start over. What stopped you? You, Jungkook said simply. Even when I couldn't reach you, you were still the reason I stayed. Taehyung's eyes finally met his, raw, unfiltered. 1,000 unsaid things passed between them, and for once, they didn't need to explain. When the morning came, they didn't speak about what had been said. There were interviews to do, schedules to follow, but the energy had shifted. They stood beside each other again during photo shoots, their shoulders touching. Taehyung's laugh came easier. Jungkook's eyes didn't dart away when they met his. Backstage before the next concert, Taehyung caught Jungkook's wrist just before they went on. He didn't speak, just ran his thumb gently over Jungkook's palm.
Still steady, he murmured. Jungkook smiled, thanks to you. As the music started, they took their positions, lights flashing, fans screaming, the universe erupting in joy around them. But at the center of it all were two souls who had nearly lost each other and chose, again and again, not to. Jungkook's voice rang clear. Taehyung's harmony soared beside him, and when their hands brushed in choreography, neither flinched. The tremble was gone, the silence was over. But the story, the real one between them, was just beginning. The rain returned that night, tapping steadily against the windows like a memory trying to find its way back in. Taehyung stood by the glass door of their suite, his silhouette dimly lit by the glow of the city's neon heartbeat. The hum of the heater blended with the sound of water on glass, creating a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. He didn't move for a while, just stood there, hands in the pockets of his loose black pants, hoodie hanging low over his frame, staring at nothing in particular. Maybe at the reflections of the past, maybe at the flickers of the future he still couldn't name. Behind him the room was warm, dimly lit. Jungkook had collapsed onto the couch after dinner, head tilted back, eyes half closed. There was an untouched mug of tea on the table between them, steam curling gently into the air. He hadn't spoken in a while, but his silence was no longer weighted. It was full of thought, not absence. His fingers played with the hem of his sleeve, slow, absent-minded. He was listening, not to Taehyung's voice, but to his presence. It was something he hadn't done in a long time. When Taehyung finally turned, his face was unreadable but softer than it had been in weeks. He walked across the room and sat on the floor in front of Jungkook, resting his arms on the couch beside the younger man's legs. His eyes searched Jungkook in the quiet. I keep thinking about that night, he said gently. Jungkook blinked, his voice low. Which one? The one where we almost said goodbye without saying it, after that show in Busan. You remember? Jungkook nodded slowly. How could he forget? It had been a brutal night. Not because of the performance, they had nailed every note, every step, but because the weight between them had been unbearable. They hadn't looked at each other once on stage. Not really. And when they'd gone back to the hotel, Jungkook had said nothing, just pulled his hoodie over his head and disappeared into his room. Taehyung had stood outside his door for 20 minutes, hand hovering near the handle, until he finally turned and walked away. That night, Taehyung continued, voice barely above a whisper, I kept wondering if you hated me. I never hated you, Jungkook said immediately, his voice a little too sharp, like the thought alone wounded him. I know that now, but back then, it felt like everything between us was unraveling, and we were both pretending it was. Jungkook leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His dark hair fell into his eyes, but he didn't move it. He looked straight at Taehyung, eyes heavy with something deep and long-suffering. I wasn't pretending. I was terrified. I didn't know how to fix it, and every time I opened my mouth, I thought I'd make it worse. So I stayed quiet, and that silence was louder than anything else. Taehyung's fingers twitched slightly. Then slowly he reached up and brushed the hair from Jungkook's eyes. The gesture was careful, familiar. Their eyes held. I missed you, Jian Jungkook, Taehyung said, and for the first time he said it like he hadn't been carrying bitterness with it. Jungkook swallowed. His throat burned, not with tears but with the pressure of restraint. You have no idea how many nights I waited for you to say that. Taehyung leaned his head against Jungkook's knee, resting there in a way that was neither intimate nor platonic, just real. Jungkook froze, then slowly lifted a hand, letting it settle gently against Taehyung's hair. The moment held. When Taehyung spoke again, his voice was deeper, more vulnerable. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had said it? If I had knocked on your door that night and you had opened it? Jungkook nodded, all the time. What do you see? I see you walking in, sitting on the edge of the bed, telling me everything you've been thinking but never said. Taehyung closed his eyes. And what would you have said back? I would have told you I was scared to lose you, not because of the group, not because of the fans, but because you matter to me more than I ever knew how to say. Taehyung's voice cracked as he whispered, You're saying it now. Too late. Taehyung shook his head slowly. No, just in time. They didn't move for a long time after that. The rain kept falling. The lights outside kept flickering, but something between them had shifted again, this time not just a crack in the wall but a door opening slowly, cautiously, carefully. The next morning the energy between them was different, not loud or overly warm but settled, balanced. They moved in sync during makeup, shared glances during sound check, smiled genuinely when their mics crackled to life and the engineer gave a thumbs up. On stage it translated into something electric. The fans noticed. Of course they did. One clip in particular went viral within hours. During the second chorus, Taehyung reached out mid-verse and brushed a stray hair from Jungkook's forehead. It wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed. Jungkook had smiled, really smiled, and Taehyung had grinned back. The screams that followed had drowned out the next beat. But it wasn't about fanservice. It was real. Later that night, as they returned to the hotel, Jungkook and Taehyung found themselves walking behind the rest of the group. The street was quiet, unusually so, the only sound their footsteps and the occasional car passing in the wet dark. They didn't speak until they reached the elevator. When the doors closed, Jungkook broke the silence. I think I'm ready to talk about all of it, everything I've kept inside. Taehyung didn't look away. Then talk, I'm here. Jungkook looked at him, really looked, and for the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't afraid. I loved you more than I understood, he said quietly. Not in the way people always assume, but in the way you love a part of yourself you can't live without. You were home. You are. Taehyung's breath caught. And when that connection broke, Jungkook continued, voice soft but certain, I felt like I lost a part of who I was. That's why my hand was trembling. Not because I was afraid of you, but because I didn't know if I'd ever find my way back. Taehyung reached out, placing a hand over Jungkook's chest. You already have. The elevator dinged, but they didn't move. And maybe in that small steel box suspended in quiet, they found something they'd been searching for all along. Not closure, not resolution, but a beginning that didn't need to erase the past. Just a chance to build forward. Together, without fear, without tremble. Only truth. The door clicked softly behind them as they stepped into the hallway. Neither said a word at first. The air was thick with the aftermath of everything that had been spoken, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was simply heavy with truth. The kind of truth that didn't demand immediate solutions, only acknowledgement. Jungkook walked slightly behind Taehyung, his footsteps quiet against the carpeted corridor and his heart strangely calm. There was no trembling in his fingers now, but there was a hum in his chest. A strange vibration, not of fear but of something deeper, something like arrival. The elevator ride up to the rooftop was silent. They didn't plan where to go, but Taehyung had pressed the button without asking, and Jungkook didn't question it. As the doors opened, a gust of cool wind slipped in, carrying the scent of wet stone and city air, mixing with the faint perfume of late-blooming jasmine that clung to the rooftop garden walls. It smelled like soul after the rain, like a memory he couldn't quite place but never forgot. They stepped into the night and the city stretched beneath them, Tokyo in all its restless, pulsing life. Neon signs blinked in the distance. Skyscrapers blinked like stars. Somewhere far below, a siren wailed, followed by the faint screech of tires, then silence again. Jungkook leaned against the railing, his hands now open, palms flat on the cold metal. Beside him, Taehyung stared out with his chin tilted upward, the wind catching the strands of his hair and pushing them back from his face. I used to come up here alone, Taehyung said quietly, back during the tour, when everything felt too loud. Jungkook glanced at him. You never told me. I didn't think you'd come. That stung more than he expected. Why wouldn't I? Because I didn't want to need you, and I was scared that if you came, I'd break. Jungkook turned, resting his elbow on the railing now, looking fully at him. You could have broken. I wouldn't have left. You were already leaving, Taehyung whispered, little by little. Jungkook looked away, his voice tight. I didn't mean to, I was hurting too. Taehyung finally looked at him, his expression unreadable but his eyes unbearably kind. I know. The wind picked up again, brushing between them, curling around their jackets. For a long while they said nothing. Just let the sky hang low above them and the world spin beneath their feet. Jungkook finally broke the silence. When did it start for you, the shift? Taehyung didn't answer immediately. Then softly he said, when you stopped laughing at my bad jokes. Jungkook blinked, that long ago. Yeah, Taehyung said, almost smiling. That's when I knew something was off. You always laughed even when they weren't funny, especially then. Jungkook's mouth twitched. They were never funny. Exactly. They both smiled, small and fleeting, but it was real. I was tired, Jungkook admitted, of the pressure, of always pretending to be okay when I was, and I didn't want to drag you into that. You wouldn't have dragged me, Taehyung said. You would have anchored me. Those words hit something soft and vulnerable in Jungkook. He closed his eyes for a second, letting the wind carry his breath away. I thought I had to be the strong one, he said. You don't, Taehyung replied, not with me. They stood like that for a long time. No fireworks, no confessions wrapped in ribbons, just the quiet surrender of two people who had worn each other's shadows for too long, finally letting the light in. Eventually, Taehyung nudged him with his elbow. Come on, let's go somewhere. Where? Anywhere. They slipped out of the hotel through a service exit, wearing masks and oversized jackets, blending into the city's endless flow. No one recognized them on the train, not at that hour. They sat side by side in silence, their knees brushing gently, the movement of the subway car rocking them closer every few minutes. It felt like they were 18 again, sneaking out after curfew, pretending the world was just theirs for a while. They ended up at a convenience store near the river, bought too many snacks, a couple cans of cold coffee, and wandered along the water until they found a bench under a street lamp. Jungkook peeled open a bag of shrimp chips. Taehyung opened the coffee. "You remember that time we got caught sneaking food into the dorm?" Jungkook asked, grinning. "Which time?" Taehyung laughed. "There were like 10. The one where you tried to hide the tteokbokki under your shirt." "Oh God, and it leaked." "Red sauce everywhere," Jungkook chuckled. "Manager Nim thought you'd been stabbed." They both laughed until they couldn't breathe, clutching their sides, faces red from the cold and from the memory. When they finally settled, Jungkook wiped a tear from the corner of his eye and looked at Taehyung. "I missed this," he said quietly. Taehyung didn't answer right away. He looked at Jungkook with a softness that held years. "I missed you." The river flowed silently behind them, its surface catching the shimmer of passing headlights. Jungkook leaned back on the bench, arms outstretched across the backrest, and for the first time in a long time he felt weightless. "You know," he said, voice almost playful, "the fans think we had a secret fallout." Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "Didn't we?" "Maybe," Jungkook admitted, "but I don't think it was a secret." They both laughed again, this time a little sadder. "I think we broke each other," Taehyung said after a pause. "Not in a cruel way, just slowly, by holding back, by assuming, by waiting." Jungkook nodded, "But we're still here." "Yeah," Taehyung said, leaning his head back to stare up at the stars. "We are." And that truth, more than any apology, any explanation, was enough for now. They walked back slowly, the city asleep around them. And when they reached the hotel, they didn't say goodnight, didn't hug, didn't make promises. But when Jungkook opened his door, he looked back and said, "Come by later, if you want." Taehyung didn't answer. But 15 minutes later, there was a quiet knock. And for the rest of the night, there was no more silence. Only the sound of 2 heartbeats, finally in sync again. Jungkook didn't rush to the door. He stood frozen for a second after the knock, his pulse a quiet thrum beneath his skin, as if his body still couldn't believe that the moment was real. That the hand on the other side of the door, the one that had once pulled him onto stages, into laughter, into unspoken comfort, had returned not for an answer but simply for presence. When he finally opened it, Taehyung stood there in his hoodie and sweatpants, hair still tousled from the wind, holding nothing but a quiet expression in his eyes. No explanations, no demands, just something raw and open and impossibly familiar. Jungkook stepped back without a word, and Taehyung entered like he belonged there. Because he did. The door clicked shut behind them and the silence in the room changed, shifted from solitude into something shared. Taehyung walked to the window first, pulling the curtain aside. The city still shimmered below, unbothered by their truths or their pain. Jungkook watched him from the couch, the soft lighting of the room brushing against Taehyung's cheekbones, casting the rest of his face in shadow. He looked older somehow, not in age but in weight, in experience. Like someone who had fought a war inside himself and was still healing from the bruises. "I couldn't sleep," Taehyung murmured, his voice so soft it almost didn't reach the couch. Jungkook leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Me neither." Taehyung turned around then and his eyes didn't waver. "Do you want me here?" It was a strange question, not because of what it asked, but because of how gently it was asked. As if Taehyung was giving Jungkook the final choice in something that had always felt out of their control. Jungkook nodded, his voice quiet but certain. "Yes." Taehyung crossed the room and sat down beside him, Not too close, but close enough for the warmth between their knees to hum in the silence. Neither reached for the TV remote. Neither opened their phones. They just sat, letting the hush stretch and settle, letting the night breathe with them. "There was a time I thought I'd never sit here like this again," Taehyung said eventually. "I thought the same," Jungkook replied. "And it scared me, how easy it was to let distance grow." Taehyung looked down at his hands. They were resting on his thighs open. He didn't clench them, didn't fidget. "You were always the one I could sit in silence with, and I lost that." Jungkook turned to him slowly, voice almost a whisper. "It's still here." Taehyung's breath caught and he looked up. And in that moment, something passed between them, not spoken, not tangible, but felt, like music that only they could hear. When Jungkook shifted to lean back against the cushions, Taehyung followed. Their shoulders brushed and neither moved away. It was quiet, safe, real. "I used to dream about this," Taehyung said after a while. "Not the concerts, not the awards, but this, just sitting here knowing we were okay again." Jungkook tilted his head to the side to look at him. What did it feel like in the dream? Taehyung smiled faintly, like peace. Jungkook let the word linger. It had always felt foreign, fleeting, like something reserved for others. But now, with Taehyung beside him, his breathing slow and even, the world outside held at bay by four walls and quiet honesty, it didn't feel so distant anymore. They stayed like that until dawn began to thread pale light through the edges of the curtains. Neither of them had fallen asleep, but they had rested, in a way they hadn't in months, maybe years. Jungkook stretched slowly, muscles sore from stillness, and looked toward the window. "It's morning." Taehyung hummed, "Yeah." Jungkook rubbed his face with his hands. "We should sleep before rehearsals." "We should," Taehyung said, but made no move to stand. Jungkook chuckled softly, "Lazy." "Comfortable," Taehyung corrected with a grin. When they finally rose, it was with the slow grace of people who had nothing left to run from. Jungkook padded to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water, then handed one to Taehyung, who accepted it with a small thanks. They didn't speak much. There wasn't a need to. The room was full of things that had already been said in silence. The next days passed with an ease that surprised them both. It wasn't that everything was suddenly perfect. There were still moments when Jungkook's smile flickered too fast, or when Taehyung's eyes darted away a second too soon, but they were noticing each other again, really noticing. And that noticing turned into small gestures, shared meals, inside jokes whispered in green rooms, quiet walks after long nights of press. They were relearning each other, not as idols or teammates, but as people. During one particularly cold night in Seoul, after a late rehearsal, they found themselves walking through an old neighborhood near the river. Their masks were up, their hands buried in jacket pockets, but their voices were soft and playful as they wandered past shuttered cafes and glowing street lamps. "You remember this place?" Taehyung asked, pointing to a tiny corner bakery with a faded pink awning. Jungkook stopped, "The one with the cream puffs. You bought 6, ate them all before we got on the train." "I was hungry." "You were gritty." "I was 17, Jungkook laughed. "And full of sugar," Taehyung added, nudging him with his elbow. They stood in front of the closed shop for a while, just watching the faint light flicker in the back room. A memory lived in that space, a snapshot of who they once were, messy, loud, happy. "You think we'll ever get back to that?" Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung didn't answer right away. He glanced at Jungkook's face, saw the way his brows creased, how his breath clouded in the air. Then he said, "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward with all of that still in us." Jungkook looked at him, something deep and grateful swimming in his eyes. "Yeah, me too." The river murmured behind them, reflecting the city lights like a promise, and they walked on, side by side, step for step, into a night that no longer felt lonely. Later, back at the dorms, Jungkook paused outside Taehyung's door. not knocking, just standing there for a moment, remembering everything they'd been through, everything they were becoming again. Then he whispered, just loud enough for the silence to carry, "Thank you for not giving up on me." From inside, Taehyung's voice was steady and warm. "I never could." And the night held them both like an old friend, no longer lost, no longer waiting. Just home, the soft click of the door behind Jungkook echoed louder in his ears than the late-night wind outside. He stood there for a beat, breath held, as if the walls around him might answer back, but no voice came. Only the quiet thud of his heart in his chest and the muffled hum of life outside the dorm, the street below, distant laughter, a city that never fully slept. He pressed his back to the door, exhaling through his nose, eyes flickering shut. The air smelled faintly of detergent and warm tea. Comfort. Memory. He'd forgotten how heavy peace could feel when it finally arrived. Across the hallway, behind the closed door of his own room, Taehyung sat on the floor, knees drawn to his chest, hoodie bunched around his neck. His fingers tapped absently against the wooden frame of the bed, his mind looping around the sound of Jungkook's voice. "Thank you for not giving up on me." It lingered, not like a haunting, but like a note left hanging in the air, waiting for its harmony. A slow smile spread across his lips, one that carried the fatigue of heartache but also the quiet bloom of something new. Hope, reconnection, a version of them that was slower, more deliberate, not born from chaotic laughter and adrenaline but from something stronger. Choice. The following days were not without their hesitations. Healing never moved in straight lines. Sometimes Jungkook would go quiet mid-conversation, eyes darkening with thoughts he still didn't know how to share. Sometimes Taehyung would retreat, distracted by memories, smiling less without meaning to. But the difference now was presence. They noticed, they asked, they waited, and they answered. During a lull between rehearsals, they found themselves alone in the studio. The others had gone for coffee, leaving the two of them in the wide, mirrored room that had once held their most tangled arguments and wordless reconciliations. Jungkook sat cross-legged in the center, head down, scrolling through a track he'd been working on. Taehyung lay on his back beside him, eyes fixed on the ceiling, arms folded behind his head. "You've been quieter lately," Taehyung said softly. Jungkook didn't look up. "I've been thinking." "About?" Jungkook paused, then about the future. Taehyung turned his head toward him, and Jungkook let the silence stretch for a second longer, then finally set his phone down. "It scares me, not because I don't want it, but because I don't know what it looks like if you're not in it." The words hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Taehyung sat up slowly, blinking as if the room had shifted around him. "You think I'd disappear again?" "I think I never fully believed you, stay," Jungkook admitted, voice low. "Not after how much we lost." Taehyung's brows pulled together, his chest tightening. "I don't want to lose you again, even if the world changes, even if we're not singing 10 years from now, even if we're just two people who meet once a year and sit under some tree somewhere. I still want you in it." Jungkook looked up, eyes searching. "Promise me something." "Anything." "If one of us ever feels it slipping again, the distance, the silence, the fear, we say something. Immediately, no pride, no waiting, just honesty." Taehyung reached across the space between them, palm open. "Deal." Jungkook took his hand. For the first time there was no tension in his grip, no tremble, only steady warmth. In the weeks that followed, their connection grew roots again. Not the same wild, youthful bloom it had once been, but something steadier. They began writing together again, sitting in hotel rooms with guitars between them, arguing over lyrics, laughing at old demos, letting themselves be vulnerable in the melodies. Their voices wove together like they always had, but now there was more behind it, more intention, more weight. One night, after a performance that left them breathless and aching from the energy of the crowd, they stood backstage beneath the red glow of exit signs, sweat still clinging to their necks. "That moment in the bridge," Taehyung said, panting slightly, "when you looked at me, I almost forgot the words." Jungkook laughed, breathless too. It was the first time I didn't have to pretend. Taehyung reached out, brushing a strand of damp hair from Jungkook's forehead. You never have to pretend again. Not with me. They didn't touch much in public. The cameras were still watching, always watching. But in quiet spaces, in shared glances, soft jokes, hands brushing too long, they carved out their own universe. In one late interview, when asked about the future of BTS, Jungkook answered first. I don't know what it'll look like, he said honestly, but I know who I want to walk through it with. He glanced sideways. And Taehyung smiled. Fans noticed, they always noticed. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't, was the quiet night 3 weeks later when Jungkook knocked on Taehyung's door at 3 in the morning, eyes red from writing lyrics he couldn't finish alone. What they didn't see was Taehyung opening the door without question, pulling Jungkook in, sitting with him on the floor until the sun came up, every line of the song turning into something more than music. What they didn't see was Jungkook finally sleeping peacefully that morning, head resting on Taehyung's shoulder, breath slow and deep. No tremble, no nightmares, just stillness. And Taehyung watching him with a quiet smile, one hand resting lightly over Jungkook, holding it steady not because he had to, but because he always would. The days began to blur again, not in the same way they once did, with relentless schedules and numbed routines, but in the gentle rhythm of familiarity returning to form. Every morning was still a rush of alarms, coffee cups, and run-throughs. But now, Jungkook found himself waking up with more ease, less dread. He wasn't reaching for his phone as soon as his eyes opened, nor was he carrying the weight of unread texts or unspoken thoughts. Taehyung had started sending photos again, blurry snaps of the sky outside his hotel room, a ridiculous selfie with his dog wearing sunglasses, a zoomed-in shot of a plate of grapes with the caption, "They look like you for some reason." Jungkook would laugh silently at them, alone in a van on the couch in between interviews, and he'd reply with something equally dumb. But they were talking again, not in long paragraphs or deep midnight confessions every night, but in rhythm, in breath. One evening, they were both booked for a variety shoot in Jeju, just the two of them. The company had arranged it, quietly, perhaps testing how the public would respond to the two of them reappearing in such a focused spotlight again. The staff was kind, respectful of their space, and the energy on set was warm, nostalgic. When they were mic'd up on the first morning, Taehyung turned to Jungkook, giving him a sly smile. Think we still remember how to do this? Jungkook raised a brow. Do what? This. He gestured to the empty field around them, the drone camera buzzing overhead, the mountains stretching behind them like quiet witnesses. Be us. Jungkook smirked. You mean annoy each other for 2 hours straight on camera? Taehyung grinned. Exactly. And they did. The banter came easily. The games brought out their old competitiveness. Jungkook still yelled when he lost. Taehyung still cheated when he could. At one point, during a challenge involving water balloons, Taehyung missed the target entirely and instead drenched Jungkook, who stood there blinking through soaked bangs while the staff burst into laughter. But Jungkook didn't flinch. He looked at Taehyung, shook the water from his sleeves, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled without guarding it. That clip, later posted on social media, reached 1 million likes in less than 20 minutes. But it wasn't the clip that mattered. It was the moment after, the one no cameras caught. Later that night, as the crew packed up and the sun fell behind the hills, they sat on the wooden steps of their cottage, drinks in hand, watching stars begin to blink into the darkening sky. The breeze carried the scent of sea salt and something green. Jungkook had a blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders, his skin still slightly damp from the shower, hair tousled. Taehyung glanced sideways. You didn't get mad when I hit you with the balloon. I was too busy trying not to laugh. You used to get mad at stuff like that. Yeah, Jungkook said. I used to hold on to things longer. Taehyung nodded slowly. I'm glad you don't anymore. Jungkook turned his head, eyes meeting his. That's because I learned that letting go doesn't always mean losing. Taehyung's jaw tightened a little just for a moment. He set his drink down beside him, then leaned back on his elbows, gaze tilting toward the stars. I still remember the night we fought in New York. I do too, Jungkook said softly. That night messed me up more than I admitted. We didn't talk for 2 weeks after that. You stopped waiting for me in the hallway before the show. Taehyung exhaled slowly. I didn't know how to fix it, and it scared me that I didn't even want to try for a while. Jungkook was quiet. Then he said, "Sometimes I think we broke each other because we didn't realize how much we mattered to one another until things got quiet." Taehyung turned to him. "I always knew you mattered. That was the problem. It made everything harder to say." The wind picked up, tugging at the loose strands of Jungkook's hair. He didn't respond, just stared ahead, lips parted like there was something he wanted to say but hadn't found the words for yet. Taehyung reached out then, hesitating for only a second before brushing a hand across Jungkook's knee. Not forceful, not even demanding comfort, just contact. The kind that says, "I'm still here, even now, even after." Jungkook glanced down, his voice low. "Sometimes I still wait for the tremble to come back." Taehyung's hand paused. "Does it?" "Not when I'm with you." They sat in that stillness until the sky went fully black and the cold made them move. Inside, under the soft lights of the living room, Taehyung pulled out an old notebook, one he hadn't opened in months. He passed it to Jungkook without a word. It was filled with half-formed lyrics, scribbles, verses that trailed off mid-thought, titles that never turned into anything. Jungkook flipped through slowly, stopping at a page near the center. There, written in uneven scrawl, was a single line. "He looked at me like he remembered every version of me, even the ones I forgot." Jungkook stared at it for a long time. "That one was about you," Taehyung said quietly. Jungkook swallowed hard. "I think I remember that version too." Taehyung leaned back into the cushions, closing his eyes. "Maybe that's the one we have to write into a song someday." "Not someday," Jungkook said. "Now." So they did. They stayed up until the sky turned pale again, working line by line, melody by melody, not worrying about whether it would chart, whether it would be performed. They were just building something together again, from the silence, from the ache, from the kind of bond that survived even when both of them thought it had unraveled. When the first demo was recorded, Taehyung listened back with his eyes closed. It was simple, just guitar, 2 voices, a harmony that had disappeared for months and now returned like breath. Jungkook watched him, heart steady. "You think people will get it?" he asked. Taehyung smiled, slow and sure. "They don't have to, we do." And when the final chorus played through the speakers, the lyrics almost whispered. Jungkook felt it deep in his chest. That quiet kind of joy that doesn't shout or flash, but instead rests in the marrow, in the places where healing hides. Not every story needs a perfect ending. Some just need a return. And sometimes, 2 people who once stood in silence find their way back not through apologies, but through the steady beat of a song only they could write. The studio was quiet except for the soft crackle of static between takes and the low hum of the heating unit in the corner. The room had that early morning stillness that lingered even after sunrise, as if the world hadn't quite decided to be awake yet. Taehyung stood near the window, his silhouette backlit by soft gray light, while Jungkook sat on the floor, back against the padded wall, knees drawn up and a pencil resting between his fingers. The last note of their demo still echoed in the silence, floating somewhere just beyond the air, suspended like breath that hadn't yet been exhaled. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't that there was nothing left to say, it was that they had finally reached a place where nothing had to be forced. For the first time in what felt like forever, every silence between them was no longer heavy with doubt or fear. It was full of understanding, memory, trust rebuilt not through grand gestures but through a series of choices. Stay, listen, try again, and again. Jungkook tapped the pencil against the edge of his notebook before finally breaking the quiet. When did you know? Taehyung turned slightly, brows drawing together in question. Know what? That we'd be okay. Taehyung smiled faintly, and his eyes softened with something like nostalgia. The night I found you asleep in the hallway outside my room. Remember that? Jungkook let out a breath of a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. You still bring that up. You curled up like a cat on my welcome mat with one sock half off. I'll never forget it. I was drunk. You were heartbroken. Jungkook's expression sobered, the memory shifting. Yeah. You knocked once. I didn't answer. You didn't leave. That's when I knew, Taehyung said quietly, that no matter how far we'd gone, we were still going to find a way back. Jungkook rested his head back against the wall, eyes trailing up to the ceiling. You could have opened the door. I wasn't ready. I thought if I did, I'd say something I couldn't take back. But you didn't say anything, Jungkook whispered. You just let me sleep outside. Taehyung's voice cracked faintly. I sat on the other side of that door all night, listening, waiting, regretting. Jungkook looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the friend he had missed but the man who had endured the same storms in different ways. And suddenly, that night felt less like abandonment and more like a mirror of his own fear.